Hello. So, over 1 million Uyghur Muslims are being held in internment camps in China at the moment, with new reports describing the forcible removal of children from their families. Considering that Australia has imposed autonomous sanctions on countries like Zimbabwe, Myanmar, and Syria for human rights abuses in the past, do you think that there is more we can do to prevent further systemic violence against this ethnic minority? Or do our trade relations trump our moral conscience?
I will start with our non-politicians. Tom.
Well, I genuinely feel your pain. On my Radio National program, I've had a few segments dealing with the besieged Muslim population of northwest China. And it's not just a question for the government, it's also the media. How often do you see this issue raised on the front pages of newspapers? It's hardly raised, I find. And it's quite extraordinary given the systematic repression of these poor souls in a brutal authoritarian regime. Now, with respect to your question, human rights is a very noble and powerful impulse, one that shouldn't be casually dismissed. And for human rights activists like Diana, they're a cause. But for governments, human rights are one of many interests that they have to take into account when they deliberate on foreign policy. Such as stability, order, prosperity. They're moral values too. So in the course of making foreign policy, governments will base their decisions according to the circumstances, and no one in their right mind is suggesting that Australia join some sort of economic embargo on China to punish them for the way they're treating the Muslim population. It's a tough issue. But this is one of the dilemmas, getting back to the original questions we were raising at the start of the show, about how we deal with our largest trade partner. How tough can we be with it?
Yana.
I would suggest a lot tougher, Tom, absolutely. The 1 million Uyghur Muslims that are in re-education camps, akin to concentration camps, are having to renounce their faith, having to be arbitrarily detained, separated from their families. Some of them are amounting to torture, the way that they're being treated. Again, Muslims suffering in our region, and we're not saying anything really, we're remaining silent. Again, with Myanmar as well, with the Rohingya Muslims there, where Australia continued to aid and support and train the Myanmar military, where there was an ethnic cleansing campaign of Rohingya Muslims there. I mean, what is it going to take for Australia to actually take a moral and principled stance on human rights? I get your point, Tom, but human rights underpins the stability of every nation. If they don't have that, then that country is not something that we should be engaging with, and we should be using all of the levers that we have to try and influence for positive change. Because how many more Uyghur Muslims, over 1 million now in China, how many more Rohingya Muslims need to be displaced from their homes? We're talking about people here again. Men, women and children being displaced from their homes.
But how can we be effective and not just merely feel virtuous? What can we actually do to change
let me throw that question to Hugh, because I want to hear from the other panellists as well. Go ahead.
Well, I think the question, you framed the question exactly the right way. On the one hand, we have a very deep and passionate, really, anxiety about what's happening, for example, to the Uyghurs. On the other hand, we have a relationship with China which just about defines our economic future. You know, if you ask the average Australian, what's our economic future? The answer is China. And one thing we can be pretty sure of is that decisive action by Australia on the Uyghur issue would have immense economic consequences for us. And that's what these guys do for a living. They strike that balance. And against a country like Zimbabwe, that doesn't matter much to us economically, it's easy. Against a country like China, and I don't want to sort of trivialise this, but our economic relationship with China relates to the economic well-being of just about everyone in this room, everyone watching. It is a huge issue. It's a terrible issue, actually. But I've got to say, pessimistically, I think the chances that anything Australia would do would actually make any difference, no matter how radical our steps were, are very low. That doesn't end the moral conversation, but it's certainly part of the moral conversation. It leaves me very gloomy about it.
Penny Wong.
Well, first, as a sort of overarching principle. Your foreign policy should be an expression of your identity, your values and your interests, and it is a question of ascertaining what is the right path through all of those propositions. Second, in relation to the Uyghurs, that has been raised. I can't speak for the government, I'll let Scott do it, but I certainly can say we have raised that publicly. The then Leader of the Opposition was asked questions about it at a particular speech he did, and he responded accordingly. We've asked questions in the Parliament, in Senate estimates about these issues, because we should ask those questions and they should be made public. What we do know and what our concerns are, because the rule of law and human rights do matter. But I think there is a reasonable question about effectiveness. There are times where private discussions are one judges to be the most effective way. There are times where public discussion is the most effective way. And the judgment about trade, I think that you reference, I think Hugh is right. The reality is, it's an asymmetric relationship economically. So I'm not sure that would be an effective way of dealing with those issues.
Scott Ryan.
Well, in short, I agree with broadly what Hugh and Tom and Penny have said. I mean, we have to look at this through the prism of our values. We do have a human rights discussion with China. But in politics, you've also got to look at capacity. And the truth is that, as Penny described it as asymmetric, we would have very little impact upon China and an enormous impact upon Australia. So the effectiveness of any action we took would be virtually zero. On that basis, I don't necessarily... I don't think we should be shy about being realistic, that we can use economic sanctions where we know they work. But there's no point necessarily in inflicting great harm upon Australians if that would damage a relationship, prevent the conversations that are always ongoing around a range of issues, but also not have the desired effect the sanction is hoped to.
What you've just
I'm going to give you the final word because we're nearly out of time, but you've heard the pragmatic arguments. Your response?
What you essentially have all said on the panel here today is that Muslim lives don't matter. That is exactly what you've said.
That's not fair.
That's what people are hearing at home, they're hearing in the audience, and that is just so heartbreaking to hear that. And I'm just really disappointed because we have so many levers in the toolbox that we could be using to influence foreign policy. We could be using it at trade, and human rights are not mutually exclusive to our values around trade. And it's really important that we try to engage critically with these nations and try to influence when these things are happening. And it's not just happening, it's a mass scale ethnic cleansing campaign in Myanmar, re-education camps of over 1 million Uyghur Muslims in China at the moment. And this is the most disappointing result, I think, from the panel tonight.
The discussion we had is not worthy of that bumper sticker, quite frankly.
I'm really disappointed. That's my opinion.
And in fact, Australia, on the Rohingya issue, has on a bipartisan basis been quite active internationally.
Still training and military haven't cut military aid.
I understand your point, but I don't think it was a reasonable proposition to put to us that somehow certain lives don't matter. All lives
that's what I'm hearing, and that's what people at home are hearing.
That is not what I am saying.
Okay.
That is not what I'm saying.
What people at home...